This video will be the second part to the Manatee's worksheet. We'll begin with the letter I. What is the fraction or percent, or sometimes it may say proportion, of the variation in the deaths variable that is explained by the least squares regression line? Now, if you recall, this is the same thing as the coefficient of determination, r squared. And if you recall, we did this in the previous video. If you go to Mini tab, select Stats, Regression, and then Regression again, here's the regression line, and r squared is right here. So what this means is 88.6% of the variation in the y variable is explained by the least square regression line. So in statistics, whenever we can explain variation, that is a good thing. The percent would be 88.6%. Question J. Does the regression line appear to be useful for prediction? Does the regression line fit the data? Explain your answer. What this question is asking is, what evidence do we have that the least squares regression line fits the data well and will be useful for making prediction? We have three pieces of information. The first one being the scatter plot. According to the scatter plot, it appears that the regression line fits the data well without any outliers. Our next piece of information would be the value of R. The value of R is 0.941, and this suggests a very strong positive linear relationship. This is our second piece of evidence. Our third piece of information is R squared. The value of R squared is 88.6%, which means that 88.6% of the variation in Manatee deaths is explained by the regression line. So the value of R squared is explaining variation in the y variable, Manatee deaths. So these three pieces of evidence states that this model, this regression line, is useful for prediction. So when you're answering this question, you want to have a summary sentence that summarizes these three pieces of information. So you could say something like this: thus, by the scatter plot, the value of R and the value of R squared all suggest that this regression line is useful for prediction. The next question, K. Predict the number of Manatee deaths when 512,000 motorbolts are registered. What is the residual for this prediction? Did the model overestimate or underestimate the number of deaths? Is this an interpolation or an extrapolation value? We'll begin with the predicted number of Manatee deaths. If the number of motorbolts is 512,000, what we're going to substitute in for our least squares regression line would be 512, because our units are 1,000. So our equation would look like this: deaths equals negative 41.4 plus 1.25 times 512, our explanatory value, and this gives us a value of 22.6. Now what does this mean? This means that the predicted value is 22.6 deaths when the number of motorbolts is 512,000. The next question is computing the residual. If you recall, in order to compute the residual, we have to have an actual y value. So if we go back to the data set, when our explanatory variable is 512, the response variable is 20 deaths. If you recall, the residual is the actual minus the predicted. It's the actual y value minus a predicted y value, y hat. The actual value for the deaths when the number of motorbolts is 512,000 is 20. The predicted is 22.6. So therefore, when we compute the residual, we take 20 minus 22.6 and we get a negative 2.6 deaths. Because the residual is negative, that means the model overestimated the actual value by 2.6 deaths. Is this an interpolation or extrapolation? This is an interpolation because the 512,000 is in the domain of the number of motorbolts. Next question. Predict the number of Manatee deaths when 900,000 motorbolts are registered. Is this an interpolation or extrapolation value? 900,000 implies what we're going to substitute in our equation is 900. 900,000 divided by our units, 1,000 equals 900. So the equation would look like this. Deaths equal negative 41.4 plus 1.25 times 900, which gives us 71.1 deaths. So this value would mean the predicted value is 71.1 deaths when the number of motorbolts is 900,000. This is an extrapolation value because it is outside the domain of the number of motorbolts. Our last question. Does this strong correlation prove that the number of registered motorbolts needs to be restricted in Florida? We cannot say that the variable number of boats is causing the deaths of the manatees, as this is an observational study. We can only conclude cause and effect with a design experiment. Moreover, there may be lurking variables. We can never prove anything in statistics. However, this association does provide some evidence that may need to be investigated further. Thanks for watching.